Good morning, everyone. Thank you so much, Gabe. You know, prizes are a really approachable idea. I mean, everyone here probably remembers when they were in high school or even junior high going after that ribbon, that gold star. And even though maybe we don't always get it, we wanted it really, really bad. And you know, prizes have been around for so long. These were the tools of kings and governments. The earliest known prize actually is even referenced in the Bible. But we've really seen a modern renaissance of prizes that's really transforming the way we bring about innovation and change in the past few decades. And a big part of that is because it really taps into the nature of humanity, of who we are. But it also has to do with a lot of the conversations and creations that you in this room are helping create to make it easier to reach that goal, to create the types of tools and exponential technologies that bring about what used to be only be able to be done by governments and big companies can now be done by individuals, you and me. And prizes have really their modern renaissance today in someone I think we're all really familiar with. It's this guy, Charles Lindbergh. We're all pretty familiar with what he did. In 1927, he landed in France, the first person ever to take a transatlantic flight nonstop from New York to Paris. But what you might not know is that this individual was motivated by a prize. It was a $25,000 prize purse. It was originally launched in 1919 by a hotel magnate in New York who wanted to bridge the distance between France and America. And he launched this competition with a single goal for the first person who could go nonstop, New York to Paris, Paris to New York, and make it in one flight. And of course, we know who won this, but you might not be familiar with the story behind that. And the story behind that is that you would not have put your money on this guy to win this prize. Charles Lindbergh was known as the Flying Fool. He was an air mail pilot with only 3 years' experience. He had no one who believed in him. To actually build his plane, he leveraged his entire savings. He mortgaged his house to do something that nobody else thought was possible, and in a different way. And what did he do? He reinvented aviation. At the time, everybody had bi-engine planes. He knew that if one engine went out over the Atlantic Ocean, he was screwed anyway. So he built a single-engine plane, the first of its kind. He was so maniacal about fuel efficiency that he even trimmed the edges of his maps to reduce and shed weight. He invented a new way to create dead reckoning when there was no other site of land available. And of course, we all know what happened. The day he landed, the world looked different. It was much, much smaller. And he did what no one else could do. Navy pilots, aeronautic experts, he was the guy that made it happen. But what's really interesting about this prize, and in reality, this prize developed and inspired the XPrize today, was what happened the day after this prize was won. So everybody remembers the celebratory arrival in France, but if you were around 3 years later, you'd see that the number of passengers flying on planes went up 30 times. Pilot licenses increased by 300%. The number of airports quadrupled in the space of a year. Because with the winning moment of this prize, things now were possible that weren't possible before. We changed what people thought was possible by a simple competition. And that really inspired the XPrize and how we got started with our very first competition, the Ansari XPrize. It was launched in 1996 with a very simple set of goals to take a privately funded individual or team to go 100 kilometers, twice in 2 weeks, carrying a passenger payload of 3 people, and privately funded. And we knew that this was going to be really hard. And it was a $10 million prize. And our founder, Peter Diamandis, went to hundreds and hundreds of companies to try to get this prize financed. And it was a great deal because you wouldn't have to pay it if it wasn't won. It would be a no-win, no-lose situation. And he went to 150 companies. And he got 150 no's. And the answers were things like, well, somebody's going to die if this happens. Or, haven't we already done that? And in fact, a little known fact is, what does the X stand for in XPrize? It was going to be the name of the donor we were going to get to fund the prize. But it took so long to raise that capital, by the time it happened, the X had stuck around. And we finally were able to raise that capital. The Ansari family came in and did this, and it was won in 2004. But we had hundreds of teams competing for this competition, about 26 that finally registered. They spent over $100 million in pursuit of this prize, and they took all different kinds of approaches. We had people that took off from land, that took off from water, that landed on parachutes, that landed on runways. And we didn't care what you tried to do as long as you got to that goal. 100 kilometers, twice in 2 weeks, passenger payload of 3 people. And the winning moment happened in 2004. What you see here is the picture of Spaceship One. Spaceship One took off on its second inaugural flight on October 4th. Brian Binney captained the actual final second round. And we all know what happened as a result of this, some pretty cool things. That plane is today in the National Aeronautics and Space Administration, the National Smithsonian Space Administration, hanging right next to the Charles Lindbergh Spirit of St. Louis. And that's pretty exciting. And the XPrize has gone a long way since then. We've launched a lot of competitions. We've awarded about $25 million in prizes. We have about $50 million on offer today, and we're looking to double that. But what I'm here to talk about today is the little-known fact about the prize industry, which is the purse really doesn't matter. Sure, it's somewhat important, and I'll talk a little bit about that, but in reality, prizes tap into many other things that matter. And I want to talk about the fact that, yeah, they encourage new thinkers and new approaches. Charles Lindbergh wasn't someone you would have bet on. They pay for only successful outcomes. If you don't win it, you don't get the money. And certainly, they provide a lot of leverage. The $10 million Ansari XPrize launched teams from around the world to spend $100 million. We think it ultimately ended up in creating a billion-dollar business, a tenfold impact on this. But the money is only part of the reason why people want to show up and give it a try and throw their hat in the ring. And so when we're designing XPrizes, we know that it's a fool's game to enter into the nuclear arms race of prize purses. You know, prizes are growing. There's over 300 prizes right now worth over $100,000 each in purses. Some people say the entire industry is around $1 billion, and that's probably going to be growing in the future. And the great news is that that's becoming a popular tool. The bad news is that it's setting off this nuclear arms race of who's going to launch the biggest and the best prizes. And individual sponsors are now taking a step back to wonder, can I really afford to do prizes now? And governments are getting into this as well. The United States of America is launching millions of dollars of competition. The European Commission is going to be launching billions of dollars of competitions. And when that happens, this becomes a fool's game. And so understanding beyond the purse what motivates individuals to compete in competitions, and specifically in prizes, is something that we pay a lot of attention to. And we found 7 things that every single XPrize has to bring and tap into to make successful. And the first is, of course, the capital. It's not necessarily having to be millions and millions of dollars. Even small purses who can help reach very significant goals for startups can make a big difference. You see here is our Nokia Sensing X Challenge. The winner of around $500,000 worth of prize purse is a woman named Anita Goel. Anita has been trying for 20 years to bring about a revolution in medical diagnostics by combining physics, nanotechnology, and biology. And she's moments away from submitting her product to the FDA for approval so that things like diagnostic diseases and other issues can be quickly assessed with the drop of a blood, and eventually show up in pharmacies and help determine what's the best medication for you, and maybe even eventually OTC products as well. This technology is now being made possible because of the capital that Anita won in that competition. But The prize isn't the ultimate outcome. The next issue is the beyond, the day after a prize is won. I told you about the Charles Lindbergh moment, the way that now all of a sudden aviation became a common method of transportation. At the end of every XPrize, what really matters is the market we've created beyond that. And nothing speaks better to that than the Ansari XPrize that really created the private commercial space industry. We think that's worth many, many billions of dollars. And for those of you who are familiar with Virgin Galactic, that technology is actually based on Spaceship One, the winning of the Ansari XPrize. And we think that that industry won't just be for space tourism, although it is pretty cool to think that just about 500 people have gone to space in all of history of humanity. And by this time next year, another 600 will probably be able to claim that right, nearly doubling that. One day, you and I will be able to go to space. And just like we get on an airplane to go from LA to San Francisco, we can go to space. But other ways are happening, and right now, even Virgin Galactic is going to be partnering with NASA, announced just last week, to actually combine space-based research on things like electromagnetic fields and fluid dynamics in space. And they're going to be taking research payloads up in addition to tourists. So the marketplace of what happens after your prize is won is just as important as the dollars that you give it to start with. And what's also important is the resources you give teams to compete. Teams and innovators need help in making that happen. And one of our prizes, the Wendy Schmidt Oil Cleanup X Challenge, happened as a result of the Deep Horizon oil spill. As you all remember back in 2010 when that leak started, and it didn't stop for 87 days. You couldn't see a newscast, a football game, a baseball game without that little camera on the bottom showing the oil spill cleaning out. And we realized in researching that nothing in terms of that technology had changed in 20 years to clean up oil from the sea's surface. Not just the type of technology, the actual equipment. The same equipment used to clean up the spill in Exxon Valdez in 1989 was being brought out to the Gulf in 2010. And we said, that's got to change. And so we launched a competition to improve oil cleanup technologies from the surface of the ocean, both in terms of the rapid recovery and the efficiency to make that happen. And we rented the only test facility in all of the entire world where you could test that type of technology. It's called OMSET. It's in the middle of New Jersey. It's run by the US Navy and costs just about $10,000 a day to rent. And even if you could get there, if you didn't have naval security clearance, you probably couldn't step foot on the property. How do you bring about new, novel types of thinkers and innovations when you can't even get access to the place where you could test them? So every XPrize builds and brings the stadium where teams compete to make it easier for teams to test their technology and focus on what they do best. In this case, not building big swimming pools where you can test technology, but building the equipment that's actually going to do it. And a little bit more on that, a next point is providing interesting and compelling work to people that otherwise wouldn't focus on your problem. I want you to meet Fred. Fred is a very highly sought-after tattoo artist, works in Vegas, and in 2007, he was helping a gentleman who needed to cover up a bad mistake. And in that, they got to talking about the Pacific Gyre full of garbage. And Fred decided that he might be able to take an approach at that problem and put down some thoughts on paper to create a product and a mechanism to clean up that garbage from the ocean. And what followed was a set of conversations that engineers from this gentleman's original company couldn't have even done. And they found out about the oil cleanup technology, or the oil cleanup challenge that the XPrize offered, and they put to test Fred's work. They tested it in his bathtub, and then his jacuzzi, and then his swimming pool. And at the end, they came to our final competition and placed 7th, knocking out industry experts all over the world. A tattoo artist from Las Vegas beat out and doubled the best technology that was available at the time to clean up oil technology. Why? Because no one else had ever asked them to do it. Providing interesting work is really compelling for that. We also try to create and legitimize people's pursuits. I'd like you to meet Walter de Brouwer. Walter de Brouwer runs a company called Scanadu that's competing in our Qualcomm Tricorder XPrize, which is bringing medical technology and diagnostics to your hand so that you don't need to go to the doctor or the hospital to make that happen. And Walter, about 4 years ago, his son fell out of an 11-story window and was admitted to the ICU for almost a year. And the amount of data and information they got on his son's condition in the course of that ICU was daily and regular. And then when they sent him home to cope with the child that remained, there was nothing except a telephone and a thermometer. And he said, that's got to change. We need more information about our health and our health metrics, and I'm going to make this happen. And so he started by building the Scout, which is a device that basically taps into your vitals and eventually will hopefully diagnose disease states. And when we launched the Qualcomm Tricorder XPrize, he said, finally, somebody knows that this is important to do. We legitimized 4 years' worth of his work, and he now has actually launched a crowdfunding campaign to fund about $2 million of this product, and he's probably going to be one of our top contenders in this team. Community. When we launched the Progressive Insurance Automotive XPrize in 2009, this was a $10 million prize for a highly efficient vehicle that could also be production capable. We wanted to get 100 miles per gallon equivalent, bringing things and changes that hadn't happened to an industry in a decade. And we wanted to bring new thinkers to that problem. And the community that came out for this competition spanned things that nothing in the automotive industry had seen. We had high school teams. We had one-man bands. We had startup innovators. We had companies that were well-capitalized but not necessarily legitimized in that space. And they came together in the final round competition, and at the end of that final stage, they started not to care who won, because they had all struggled so far to get there, to take down the naysayers, to raise the money, to prove that the industry could change, even though no one had done it for decades. And there's a story I like to tell of a gentleman, the one-man band. He was a one-guy show. And he had to install the black box, right? The data box to gather the acquisition of the content and data to judge the prize. And he didn't have enough time to install it because he didn't have a team. And 2 of the other teams adopted him and helped him whenever he needed to put in data systems, to make changes, to improve his own engine. And at the end, when the final testing happened and 100 laps had to occur to see your battery length, when he couldn't make it over the last 50 yards because his battery died, 2 of those teams came out and pushed him over the finish line. The community that was involved there showed and demonstrated that the prize isn't just about the competition. It's about the relationships and impact that you create. And of course, glory. Every XPrize and every prize has to tell the story of the teams that compete, to make heroes out of their efforts because they're working their blood, sweat, and tears to the bone. Dave Maston came on this cover of Aviation Week and named the Space Entrepreneur of the Year, was the winner of the Northrop Grumman Lunar Lander X Challenge, which was a $1 million competition to develop a vertical takeoff and landing device that could actually land something on the moon and get back to the orbit of the moon safely. And telling his story and telling the stories of the 15 teams that competed on this finally made it real to people, that there were entrepreneurs and hardware experts and energy efforts happening to create the commercial space industry, the private space industry that would benefit all of us. And it's imperative that you share those stories. Every XPrize is at least half of our cost is the actual operation of those prizes, and half of that is telling the story and the so what about why we've chosen to do it. And it's so important to make and promote that. So as you think about using prizes, and as XPrize thinks about designing our competition, we take those 7 things and ask the following types of questions. 1, you've got to make sure you've got a sufficient purse, but it doesn't have to be as large as the next one. Because if you can also design your competition for the day after your prize is won, what's the market opportunity that you've created for these individuals to take advantage of the new space you've helped create? If you can define a difficult but achievable target so that you make it interesting for people that otherwise wouldn't care about your problem to step up and say, I think I might try. If you can offer a clear measure of success, specifically in a place that's been lacking legitimacy, you give meaning to people's pursuits. Every XPrize is extremely measurable. We don't launch ice skating contests. We tend to launch swimming contests, things that are clearly defined and legitimize when someone has achieved a goal. entice a broad community. We want to see people that otherwise would never approach a problem come together in a unique way that isn't just about the competition, but it's about the community of people that have been created to help address that issue. And we try to make it rewarding and simple for teams to compete. We provide to them the playing field, we make sure they have the financial backing to make this happen, and a support network so that they can focus on the problem that they came out there to solve. And lastly, make sure that you tell a great story. Have a friendly winning moment. A rocket going into space is a great place to start. But tell the stories of the teams, because they're the ones legitimizing this space and doing the heavy lifting. So as I leave you today and you think about gamification, don't forget about the simplest and very old tool called a prize. But don't be lured into the nuclear arms race of developing bigger and better purses, because it's so much more than that. Tap into those pieces. And if you guys have great ideas for what you think the next XPrize should be, please come find me. I'll be around for the rest of the day. Thanks so much.